Thanks for joining us today in our breakout session for a discussion about a topic of interest to many of us in both our professional and personal capacity: the impact of the COVID-19 vaccine on the U.S. workplace. We're going to go ahead and get started as we know few folks are still joining the session. As a few housekeeping matters to get us started, you'll have the opportunity to pose some questions in the Q&A feature that's located on the right hand of the screen. We'll try to get to those questions as time allows as we go through the session. My name is Benita Jones. I'm a labor and employment attorney and a member of Womble's School Law and Education team, and I'm pleased to be joined today by my colleague, John Puchel, who's a labor and employment attorney. There are new developments on this issue on a daily basis. John and I could talk for hours about this issue and never exhaust, I think, the new updates and trends and news that's coming out around COVID and the COVID vaccine. Many of us awakened this morning to the good news that there may be a third vaccine from Johnson & Johnson coming onto the market sooner rather than later, with also the concerning news that one of the variants of the virus may have signs of community spread already in the United States. There are a lot of unknowns around this issue, so I want to start with a disclaimer. First, John and I are lawyers. We are not psychics. Although we have had the opportunity to hone our abilities to navigate both the novel and the unknown since March of 2020, when the World Health Organization declared coronavirus as a global pandemic. And we are not done yet. In August of 2020, an article in Nature magazine shared various predictive models about how the pandemic may play out in 2021 and beyond. And one common theme is that coronavirus is with us for the long haul and has the potential to have annual surges of infection through 2025 and beyond. One quote in that article stood out in particular and noted that although forecasts and timelines may vary, modelers agree on two things. One, that COVID-19 is here to stay. And two, that the future depends on a lot of unknowns, including whether people develop a lasting immunity to the virus, how seasonality affects its spread, and perhaps most importantly, the choices made by governments and individuals. So as we're in the midst of the rollout of the COVID vaccine, employers have the opportunity to make choices that may shape the trajectory of the pandemic. We'd like to start by collecting some data from you. We're going to open a poll shortly and get you engaged and participating. We'd like to get your opinion on how you think the vaccine may impact your workforce. 3 questions here. 1 about when you anticipate your workplace going back to pre-pandemic or the BC before COVID times. What percentage of the individuals in your workplace do you think will get the vaccine? And whether your workplace is currently considering a vaccine mandate. We'll close the polling in a few moments, and then we'll discuss the results a little later in the session. But while we are collecting some information from you, I want to start with a little bit of data. Jason, if you can move to the next slide. A Pew Research Center poll released in December 2020, shortly before the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines received emergency use authorization and were on the market, reflected that a majority of U.S. adults either definitely or probably would get the vaccine. However, there is still a sizable minority of individuals saying that they probably or definitely would not. And those opinions did not change if those individuals knew people who'd received the vaccine or even just had more information and data about the vaccine. The demographic differences around a vaccine intention that are reflected on that second chart show some interesting trends around personal attitudes towards likelihood to get the vaccine. you will note that the portions of the population that are older, have higher income, have more education, are more liberal, and are white and non-Black persons of color are more likely to get the vaccine. There are various factors that are informing these attitudes and intentions. Some are just coming from trust in the vaccine research and development process, trust in science, personal health choices, and general attitudes towards vaccines in general. And there are also some deeper structural and historical issues at play. And a phrase I heard this morning, more nuanced hesitancy towards getting the vaccine that may be linked to medical ethics and healthcare equity and access, particularly in low-income communities and communities of color. Approximately 6 weeks in to our national rollout of the vaccine, it is likely that opinions on the vaccine remain unchanged. I'd like to compare this individual data to some polling done by SHRM, the Society of Human Resource Management, also conducted and released in December, which found that 61% of US organizations intend to encourage, but not require, their employees to receive the vaccine. But 66% of employers say that the vaccine is very or somewhat necessary to their business continuity. So if it's so important to your business continuity, can you mandate the vaccine? Next slide, Jason. Yes, but. And we phrase this as it is legally permissible at this time for an employer to require employees to receive the COVID vaccine, but you need a plan. My colleague is going to talk more about some of these specific legal issues, but as a baseline, the EEOC released some technical assistance in mid-December in anticipation of employers thinking through how they wanted to approach the vaccine in their workplace. And just a few high-level legal issues to ensure that your plan includes. One, the EEOC has made it clear that the COVID vaccine itself is not considered as a medical examination if it's administered by an employer or third party, contracted by the employer to provide it to the employee. And similarly, asking an employee for proof that they have received a vaccine is not a medical or disability related inquiry under the ADA. However, those pre-screening questions that are necessary to determine if someone is medically able to receive the vaccine will trigger an analysis under the ADA about a disability-based inquiry and must be job-related and consistent with business necessity. Again, John's going to talk more about that in a few slides. Further, a mandate at a baseline needs to take into account exemption for those who are disabled and unable for medical reasons to receive the vaccine or have a sincerely held religious belief and cannot receive the vaccine to stay in compliance with federal employment law. In addition, watch what's happening in your state legislatures. Again, we said that at this time, there is no prohibition. However, in interesting protection of individual liberties news, there are several states that have already introduced legislation that would restrict government entities and employers from mandating the vaccine and ensure that it is a personal choice for citizens in those states. And then similar to the considerations that employers have had around wage and hour compliance if you're doing COVID testing in the workforce, if you're going to mandate the COVID vaccine, similar analysis. Are you going to pay your non-exempt employees for time spent getting the vaccine? And if you're not, do you want to be a test case around that issue? So next slide, please, Jason. The question of can you is different from should you. Your legal counsel can outline these threshold legal issues around a vaccine mandate, but there are much more nuanced risk and policy considerations around determining how your organization wants to approach the vaccine in your workforce? And that larger question of what type of employer do you want to be regarding the vaccine? The public opinion data that we shared at the beginning of this presentation shows that their strong attitude around vaccine hesitancy in what may already be a polarized workplace. I want to emphasize in particular the COVID vaccines that are on the market now are under emergency use authorization status, and that's a key part of the can you or should you analysis. Under the EUA status, while these vaccines are legally on the market, there are various unknowns about the long-term efficacy as well as lack of data about long-term effects and testing on adolescents and pregnant individuals. That is a key distinguishing factor between flu and other vaccine mandates that have full FDA approval and a COVID vaccine mandate. And note, under the EUA status, recipients are required to be informed that they have the right to refuse or accept administration of a product under EUA status. So that leaves employers with a hard decision about what are you going to do if an employee refuses the vaccine on that basis, and possibly vulnerable to claims of wrongful discharge in violation of public policy if you terminate an employee for refusing under the EUA status. There are, of course, the unknowns such as supply chain issues, access and distribution issues, which will impact when you will realistically be able to have your employees comply with a vaccine mandate. It may not be until the summer or into the fall when there's enough supply of the vaccine in circulation to get to the majority of U.S. adults. John, how else are you advising clients on how to navigate some of these should you and risk assessment questions? You muted, John.
Sorry about that. Thanks, Benita. Advising employers remains a challenging endeavor, as it has since March of this year, roughly March 13th for me, when the stay-at-home orders began. And so every day is kind of a new adventure. This COVID has been the most disruptive thing I've seen in my 20 years of practice, bar none, given the risks, the concerns, the fact that it's such a broadly and widely impactful situation. So employers trying to keep their eye on keeping their business open, keeping their employees here and working and safe and paid, and keeping relevant constituencies safe, whether that's students, whether that's patients, whether that's customers. It's been a real challenge for employers, as I'm sure all of you know, as you have lived it. So we've had a lot of hard conversations with clients. Clients have had hard internal conversations about how to navigate these things. And I think the mandate or not mandate question is just going to be another one of these hard conversations as we continue to navigate the arc. Hopefully it's an arc and not a straight upward line of this pandemic. But in terms of keeping your eye on liability and legal compliance when it comes to your workers, there's two big bundles of risks that I see when surrounding the mandate. First, the liability if you mandate. So if you require your employees to get the mandate. And I think that first group of risk is really limited to your employees. What if they have an adverse reaction? What if you ask them to do something that the law said is not compliant in terms of making them get the shot? So I think your first group of risks is with your employees. The second group of risk is what's the liability if you can mandate, and we've shown that you can. If you can mandate but you don't, can you be liable for that, or what kind of exposure for liability could you foresee coming out of that? And here, I think the potential group that's at issue is not just your employees themselves, but coworkers of the employees. So for example, if you don't mandate and a coworker spreads the virus to other coworkers? What's your exposure when those other employees complain about that? Or what if your employees expose a third party, customer, patient, student, you name the relevant constituency? Might you have any claim to those third parties? So I think if we think about the first group, liability to the employees, what if you mandate, what could those look like? So when it comes to the vaccine and the virus, let's say if you require a mandate, excuse me, if you require your employees to get a shot, what kind of exposures can come from it? So first you have employment liability. We're going to talk in the next slide about the ADA and Title VII. But what kind of liability might you have if you don't require the mandate for your own employees? Well, the good news is in most jurisdiction, workers' compensation law is being held, or COVID is being found to be a workers' comp compensable injury in most cases. A number of states have passed laws that say we're going to create a rebuttable presumption that if you are a first responder, if you are a teacher, if you're a child care worker, and you get the job, they're going to presume that you got that on the job. And I think it's important to know that employers want injuries and claims and exposures to be covered by workers' comp because it's an exclusive remedy. So in other words, if you get an on-the-job injury or an occupational exposure, which a virus would be, it's nice to know that the employee's liability or your liability is limited to workers' comp, which is insurance. The employee generally cannot sue you unless there is, sort of an intentional or grossly negligent act. And so that workers' compensation liability is a comfort when it comes to employee claims. But the more challenging question is that second group of risk. What if you can mandate but you don't? What if the employee spreads it to others, maybe to coworkers? Well, this is where workers' comp comes back in. So let's talk about the first group. You don't mandate, one of your employees spreads the virus to others. Well, those other employees are probably going to be stuck with the remedy provided by workers' compensation in most cases. To get around that, the employee would have to show, hey, employer, you were grossly negligent in not requiring or mandating a vaccine, or your failure to follow through on your mandate has led to your exposure, and that's grossly negligent during a pandemic. Our experience so far, and it's still a little bit early to tell because it's way too early to tell because the vaccine is just now becoming generally available to folks, is whether employees are going to have any success arguing that if you don't mandate. This is one of these watch and see moments. What do the state workers' compensation companies do? Do the courts let people get outside of workers' comp if you can mandate and you don't, and you can somehow tie it to prove that it was resulted from one of your coworkers? The second group, what's your potential exposure to third parties? Again, too soon to tell, with the virus or the vaccine, again, just now being rolled out. But I've learned a few things about lawyers over the years, and they can be pretty creative when it comes to pushing the boundaries of legal theory. But I think you don't have to stretch legal theory too far to envision a scenario where someone somewhere claims, hey, you could have required all of your employees to get a vaccine, and it was grossly negligent or grossly irresponsible not to mandate. And as a result of your failure to mandate, which you could have done, you have made my mother-in-law, it caused my mother-in-law to be exposed and contract the virus. Or, or they could say, you didn't mandate, my dad that works at the company got it and brought it home and spread it to the family. Those kind of claims. That's not a real stretch. And I think you will see those kind of claims. You've seen similar claims sort of in the negligence cases in some of the nursing homes throughout the country where folks say, hey, if you'd been more vigilant in your safety precautions, then, you know, my father, parent, whatever, would not have contracted the virus in your facility. So one of the things to keep an eye on are what are other companies in your area or your sector doing, because that could create a standard of care. You know, if everyone in your sector requires mandates, but you don't, you know, you would be the outlier, and someone could easily say, hey, everyone else did it. That shows it's pretty reasonable. You are unreasonable in refusing to do that. So that's the sort of the third party group of risks. I'll return to the first group of risks, if I could. So Jason, could you move over to the next slide? And in addition, if you've not had the chance to answer our polls, please go ahead and do that. I want to talk for just a couple of minutes on disability and religious accommodations. And just know that we could talk for about 30 minutes or more if we wanted to just on this. These are complicated and deep issues, but I just want to hit at a high level some big picture items for you here. The two principal laws that are applicable to the virus and to a vaccine mandate are the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. That covers disabilities, and ADA covers disabilities, and Title VII covers sincerely held religious beliefs. And the issue, what we're focusing on here is, what if you want a mandate and you require employees go get a shot, and they say, no, I've got a disability, I have a sense, I've got a condition that would that put me at greater risk if I got a shot. Or what if someone says, due to my sincerely held religious beliefs, I cannot get a vaccine. It would cause me to offend the tenets of my beliefs or my faith. How do you handle that? Well, both laws have their own regime, their own regulatory scheme, and they both require accommodations to employees to deal with disabilities or for sincerely held religious beliefs, but the standards are not exactly the same. So I want to talk for a few points under the ADA. A couple of things. Employers may not require employees to get medical examinations or make disability-related medical inquiries unless the examination or inquiry is shown to be job-related and consistent with business necessity. So a couple of points that are clear per the EEOC. Getting a vaccination does not constitute a medical exam. And asking for proof that you have a vaccine does not count as a medical exam or an inquiry. So you can require your employees, go get a shot, come back and show us that you've gotten it. And that does not implicate the ADA. So for example, if you're not giving the shots yourself, or you're not contracting with someone to give the shots on site, then you really have a much lower risk profile under the ADA. But do be mindful, when you get a vaccination, you often have to fill out the waiver and the questions. Do you have any sensitivities to, I think egg products is one of them that comes to mind. Those questionnaires can be medical inquiries. And so that's where it's real important. If your policy is go to CVS or anywhere you want your doctor, get a shot, bring us proof, you're outside of the ADA. If you are doing those inquiries and the shots yourself, or you're directly contracting with a third party to do it for you, then the ADA would be implicated, and that questionnaire now suddenly becomes an inquiry, and it's got to be job related. So I want to move ahead to sort of the direct threat. So what if you require a mandate and the employee objects and says, I've got a disability, and they do? What are your obligation then? Well, per the EEOC, again, an employer can pursue a mandatory vaccination rule if the company determines that an employee would pose a direct threat to others in the workplace. And you got to consider a few things: the duration of the risk, the nature and severity of the potential harm, the likelihood that the potential harm will occur, and the imminence of the potential harm. So usually direct threat is in non-pandemic times very hard to prove a direct threat to meet that burden for an employer. But I think in the pandemic, it's much easier to do it because the virus is very contagious. It's everywhere. If you get it, it can have very serious consequences. But again, it's going to depend a little bit on your workforce or what you do. For example, if you are in the lighthouse business and one of your employees is a lighthouse keeper on an island by himself for 6 months a year in the Aleutians, then it's going to be pretty hard to argue he poses a direct threat to himself or others way out there. But it's a very different analysis if, for example, you run a medical center or a retirement community. You can see that that analysis and that risk assessment is very different. But I think my takeaway or my belief at this point is that employers are going to have a pretty successful time arguing direct threat in this environment because it doesn't kill everybody, but it does kill people. So we're dealing with a contagious and serious virus. And so if you're requiring a mandate and the employer an employee refuses, I think the employer would have a pretty good place today, and things might be different in 6 months, but saying, hey, this is a serious deal. We can help take steps to stop it. We're requiring a mandate because if you don't get it, you pose a direct threat to our coworkers or to students or to patients or whatever. A couple points on religion on Title VII. Someone has a sincerely held belief. The first thing I would say is, what is a sincerely held belief? And I will tell you that the courts have struggled with that, but the takeaway is you need to be reluctant to challenge someone's sincerely held belief because it's on the inside of them, right? Very hard to show that's not sincere. And so I think most of the time you're safest presuming that if someone says they have a sincere belief, you should assume that it probably is, or at least it's something you probably don't want to fight about in court. But the second part of that is it's employer has a little better standard, more flexible standard than it does under disability accommodation. So for Title VII and religious accommodation, if the employer can show that it would be the burden is more than a de minimis cost, which is really anything, right? Having to change schedule or anything really, then you don't have to grant the accommodation. So employers are on a little stronger footing in opposing sincerely held religious objections to, for example, the vaccine. Last point on this, all of these things are always case by case. You have to look, are you a lighthouse keeper or do you work in a medical center or a retirement community? What is your job within those environments? Those kind of things. So it's always going to be case by case. You can never have a rule that says this is always the rule for every employee across every jurisdiction that we're in. And you always, of course, have to document. Jason, can I get you to go to the next slide?
John, I think we're actually running very close on time, so we may want to jump to the next slide, which will loop in some of this conversation about there's no one-size-fits-all approach.
Yes, let's do that.
And a couple of key takeaways when you're going back to your organizations. I see a question about, should you be asking for proof of the vaccine even before you are considering if you want to have a mandate? We haven't talked a lot about incentives, but some of you may see those on the news as well. Similar type of legal analysis that we've talked about. If you're having an incentive program as well, make sure they aren't coercive. Make sure you are implementing an incentive program like paid time off or bonus pay in a non-discriminatory manner and in an equal manner. But some 4 key takeaways as you're deciding how you want to approach the vaccine: mandate, incentive, or just require proof. 1, what are your business goals? Get the right folks at the table to have that conversation. And it is a different analysis between should we mandate the vaccine, or what do we want to do with the vaccine, and when are we going to all be back in the workplace? You will still be living with your safety protocols while we're having a vaccine rollout. What are your risk profiles? What's the risk of transmission if you want to roll out messaging around the vaccine? How are you going to ensure legal compliance, even if you are asking to see proof? How are you going to maintain that information? How are you going to make sure that information is asked of employees in a uniform way? And then most importantly, what are the impacts outside of your control? What forces are outside of your control? Where are we with just supply chain and availability and government prioritization? And if you start asking for proof now, how long will it take for you to be able to get to compliance? And what do we know about if that's really going to be sufficient to fight against new virus strains? I think we are out of time. Now, there are some additional resources at the end of the presentation that you may find useful as you are taking these 4 critical questions back to your organizations and workplaces. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, and enjoy the rest of the summit.